A freezing puppy scratches at a man's door, begging to be let inside. At first, he ignores it. He doesn't have time for strays. But the moment he finally opens that door, his world turns upside down. Because what happens next is something he never saw coming, and it will change everything. What secret does this puppy bring with it? And why will this one decision alter the course of his life forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding onto the 12th floor. Ethan Reynolds dragged himself down the hallway, his leather briefcase feeling heavier than usual after 14 hours at the office. Snow had started falling hours ago, coating Chicago in a thick white blanket that muffled the usual city noise. He reached into his coat pocket for his keys, the metal cold against his fingers. The hallway lights cast long shadows across the pristine carpet as he approached his door. That's when he heard it, a faint scratching sound, barely audible. Looking down, Ethan froze. A small puppy, no bigger than a loaf of bread, huddled against his doorframe. Its brown fur was matted with snow and ice, and it trembled violently in the hallway's artificial warmth. When it lifted its head, Ethan saw eyes that seemed too big for its tiny face, filled with a desperate kind of hope. "No," he muttered, turning back to his lock. "Absolutely not." The puppy whimpered softly, curling into an even tighter ball against his door. Ethan tried to focus on fitting his key into the lock, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. The sound of chattering puppy teeth cut through his resolve like a knife. "Someone else will find you," he said firmly, more to convince himself than the dog. "This is a big building. Lots of people love pets." But the hallway remained empty, and the puppy pressed closer to his shoe, seeking any hint of warmth. Ethan closed his eyes and let out a long breath that fogged in the air from the draft under the door. "One night," he growled, pushing his door open. "That's it." The puppy didn't move at first, as if unsure of the invitation. Then, with a quick scramble of tiny paws, it darted inside, making straight for the heating vent in the corner of his living room. Ethan set down his briefcase and went to the linen closet, grabbing the oldest towel he could find. The puppy didn't resist when he scooped it up, its whole body still shaking. As he dried the matted fur, chunks of snow melted onto his hardwood floor. "You're making a mess," he grumbled, but his hands were gentle as he worked. Once the puppy was mostly dry, he filled a small bowl with water and set it down. The little dog lapped at it eagerly. Later, as Ethan climbed into his king-sized bed, he could hear the soft click of puppy nails on the floor as his uninvited guest explored the apartment. The sound of quiet sniffing followed, punctuated by occasional tiny sneezes. Despite his exhaustion, he found himself listening to these small sounds, tracking the puppy's movement through his normally silent home. The rhythmic patting of paws and gentle breathing gradually grew fainter as sleep began to take hold. For the first time in years, Ethan drifted off to something other than complete silence in his perfectly ordered world. The morning sun filtered through Ethan's bedroom windows, rousing him from sleep. He blinked, memories of last night's unexpected guest flooding back. With a groan, he pushed himself out of bed, already regretting his moment of weakness. "Might as well check on the little troublemaker," he muttered, padding into the living room in his sleep clothes. The blanket he'd left by the heating vent lay empty and undisturbed. Ethan's jaw tightened with irritation. The puppy must have slipped out when he wasn't looking, probably through the door he'd forgotten to double-check before bed. A soft sound from outside his apartment caught his attention. Rhythmic breathing, barely audible through the heavy door. Ethan's brow furrowed as he approached, turning the handle slowly. What he saw made his heart stutter in his chest. A small boy, no more than 10 years old, was curled up on the hallway floor. His clothes were worn thin and dirty, hanging loose on his skinny frame. Dark hair stuck out in every direction, and his cheeks were flushed pink from the building's chilly corridor. The puppy from last night was tucked against his chest, both of them huddled together for warmth. Ethan's hand instinctively moved toward his phone. He should call the police. That would be the sensible thing to do. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the protective way the puppy lifted its head at his approach, letting out a low warning growl. Or maybe it was how vulnerable the boy looked, his face peaceful in sleep despite his clearly desperate circumstances. Crouching down, Ethan gently touched the boy's shoulder. The reaction was immediate and violent. The child's eyes snapped open, wide with terror, and he scrambled backward until he hit the wall. His arms tightened around the puppy, shielding it with his own body. "Don't take him," the boy croaked, his voice rough and barely audible. "Please." "Hey, it's okay," Ethan said quickly, keeping his voice soft and raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to take him. He's yours." The boy didn't answer right away, his eyes darting between Ethan and the open apartment door. The puppy had stopped growling, but remained alert, pressed close to the boy's chest. "His name is Max," the boy finally whispered after a long silence. "I'm Oliver. Ollie." "Where are your parents, Ollie?" Ethan asked carefully. Ollie's face closed off immediately, and he pressed his lips together, refusing to answer. His only response was to hold Max tighter, as if the puppy was his only lifeline in the world. Ethan stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair as he considered his options. None of them felt right. Finally, surprising himself more than anyone, he gestured toward his open door. "Come inside," he said. Ollie remained frozen for a moment, studying Ethan's face with an intensity no child should possess. Then, slowly, still clutching Max to his chest, he pushed himself to his feet and took a tentative step toward the door. Ollie inched through the doorway, his shoulders hunched and tense. His eyes swept across Ethan's living room, taking in the sleek furniture and spotless floors. Every few seconds, his gaze would dart to the exits, the windows, the front door, the hallway leading deeper into the apartment. Max stayed quiet in his arms, but his little tail had started wagging slightly in the warmth of the room. "You can sit down," Ethan said, gesturing to the couch. He kept his voice neutral, trying not to spook the boy. Ollie shook his head. "I'm okay standing." "Where did you sleep last night?" Ethan tried. "Around." "And your parents?" Silence. "Any relatives I could call?" More silence. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm trying to help here." "Nobody asked you to," Ollie muttered, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his tough act. "Tell me about Max," Ethan said, changing tactics. "How long have you had him?" For the first time, Ollie's face softened slightly. He looked down at the puppy in his arms, scratching behind its ears. "Found him 3 weeks ago, behind a dumpster. He was all alone, like me." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "We keep each other warm at night. He's really smart. He can find food sometimes, and he always knows when someone bad is coming." Ethan watched as Ollie spoke about Max, noting how the boy's entire demeanor changed when talking about his four-legged friend. The defensive wall came down just a little, revealing glimpses of the child underneath. "Are you hungry?" Ethan asked. Ollie's eyes flickered up, then back down. He shrugged. "I'm ordering pizza." When the doorbell rang 20 minutes later, Ollie jumped. The smell of hot cheese and tomato sauce filled the apartment as Ethan set the box on the coffee table. He opened it, watching from the corner of his eye as Ollie's gaze fixed on the steaming slices. "Eat," Ethan said simply, taking a slice for himself. Ollie didn't move at first. He stood there, still holding Max, staring at the pizza like it might disappear. Finally, he took a small step forward, then another. Setting Max down gently, he reached for a slice with trembling fingers. The first bite was tentative. The second was bigger. By the third, he was wolfing down the pizza like he hadn't eaten in days, which Ethan realized with a pang might well be true. After dinner, Ethan retrieved a thick blanket from the hall closet. "You can sleep here tonight," he said, placing it on the couch. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Ollie didn't argue. He simply nodded, already looking drowsy from the warm food and heated room. He curled up on the couch, pulling the blanket around himself. Max hopped up beside him, turning in a circle before settling against Ollie's chest. Ethan switched off the lights, leaving just the soft glow of a lamp in the corner. As he headed toward his bedroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something he wasn't ready for. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across Ethan's bedroom floor. He blinked awake, his mind immediately going to his unexpected house guests. The apartment was too quiet. Throwing off his covers, he hurried to the living room. The couch was empty. The blanket lay neatly folded on one cushion, but there was no sign of Ollie or Max. Ethan's heart raced as he checked the kitchen, the bathroom, every corner where a small boy and his puppy might hide. Nothing. Annoyance crept in, replacing his initial panic. What had he expected? Of course the kid would run. That's what street kids did, right? Take what they could get and disappear. At least the boy had folded the blanket before leaving. Ethan got ready for work, trying to push away the nagging worry in his chest. He grabbed his briefcase, straightened his tie, and opened the front door. There, sitting on the cold concrete steps, was Ollie. Max lay curled in his lap, tail thumping softly against the boy's leg. They both stared out at the snow-covered street, seemingly lost in thought. Ollie's thin jacket offered little protection against the morning chill, and his shoulders were hunched against the cold. "You're still here?" Ethan couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Ollie glanced up at him, then quickly looked away. He shrugged one shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. Didn't want to leave without saying thanks. Something about those words made Ethan stop. The simple honesty in them, the hint of something more. He should call child services. He should go to work. He should do anything except what he was about to do. "Come inside," he found himself saying. "It's freezing out here." Ollie hesitated, then slowly stood up, cradling Max against his chest. As the boy stepped back into the warm apartment, Ethan made a quiet decision. He wouldn't push Ollie out, not yet. He'd give it a day or two, just enough time to figure out what to do next. But deep down, a part of him already knew this was going to be much longer than a few days. The morning light crept through the windows as Ethan adjusted his tie, briefcase in hand. His mind was already racing through the Thompson merger case, the depositions, the contracts, the mountain of paperwork waiting at the office. But his steps slowed as he passed the living room. Ollie lay curled up on the couch, one arm draped over Max. The puppy's chest rose and fell in sync with the boy's quiet breathing. The blanket had slipped halfway to the floor, and Ollie's messy hair stuck out in all directions. Ethan's hand hesitated on the doorknob. He should lock up. It was the sensible thing to do. If the kid ran off with something valuable, it would be his own fault for being careless. But as he watched Ollie shift in his sleep, pulling Max closer, something made him pause. With a quiet sigh, he left the door unlocked and headed out. At the office, Ethan struggled to focus. The Thompson case files lay spread across his desk, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone. During a crucial client meeting, he caught himself checking it under the table, half expecting to see his apartment's security system alerting him to movement. "Mr. Reynolds?" His client's voice snapped him back to attention. "The liability clause?" "Yes, of course," he muttered, forcing himself to concentrate. This was ridiculous. He had a massive case to handle. He couldn't waste time worrying about some street kid he barely knew. The sky had already darkened when Ethan finally left the office. His stomach churned as he approached his apartment door. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. He steeled himself for an empty apartment, maybe some missing valuables. But when he pushed the door open, the sight stopped him short. Ollie sat cross-legged on the floor, Max curled up beside him. The TV played softly in the background, casting flickering shadows on the wall. The kitchen counter, usually cluttered with his morning coffee cups, was spotless. The dishes were stacked neatly in the drying rack. "You stayed," Ethan said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Ollie glanced up briefly before returning his attention to the TV. He shrugged one shoulder, his voice quiet, but matter-of-fact. Nowhere else to go. Ethan stood there for a moment, his briefcase heavy in his hand. He didn't respond, but something shifted in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Later that night, as he got ready for bed, Ethan tried to remind himself that this was temporary. Just a few more days, that's all. Just until he figured out what to do next. But deep down, he knew he was already invested. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across Ethan's living room. He watched from the kitchen as Ollie ate his breakfast, noting how the boy hunched over his bowl of cereal, spoon moving quickly from bowl to mouth. Even after 3 days, Ollie still ate like someone might snatch the food away at any moment. Max lay at Ollie's feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor whenever the boy dropped a piece of cereal. The puppy had grown more comfortable too, but like his young companion, remained alert to every sound. Ethan noticed other things too. The way Ollie's shoulders tensed when a car honked outside. How he kept his worn sneakers on even while sleeping, laces tied tight. The boy's eyes constantly darted to the exits, windows, doors, anywhere that might offer escape if needed. That afternoon, Ethan left work early, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the strange pair who'd taken up residence in his apartment. As he approached his door, he heard shuffling inside. The sound made him pause before turning the key. When he opened the door, he found Ollie frozen mid-step, a small backpack clutched in his hands. Max stood beside him, tail low, but still wagging slightly at the sight of Ethan. Ollie was stuffing something into the bag, Ethan's spare gray hoodie, the one he'd left draped over the couch. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Going somewhere?" Ollie's fingers tightened around the backpack straps. He stared at the floor, scuffing one shoe against the hardwood. After a long moment, he shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't want to be a bother." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He looked at the boy, really looked at him. The defensive posture, the expectation of being thrown out, the constant readiness to run. Something twisted in his chest, a mix of anger and sadness at whoever had taught this kid to expect the worst. "You don't have to sneak out," Ethan said finally, keeping his voice steady. "If you want to leave, just tell me." Ollie didn't respond. His eyes darted between Ethan and the door, calculating. Max pressed against his leg, looking up at him with those big brown eyes. Slowly, very slowly, Ollie lowered the backpack to the floor. That evening, as darkness settled over the city, Ethan noticed something different. Ollie was getting ready for bed, arranging his blanket on the couch like usual. But this time, he paused. Carefully, deliberately, he untied his shoelaces. The sneakers came off, placed neatly beside the couch. It was such a small thing, just a pair of shoes. But to Ethan, watching from the hallway, it felt like something much bigger. It felt like progress. The sound of laughter drifted through Ethan's apartment, pulling him from sleep. He blinked, confused by the unfamiliar noise. It came again, light and genuine, followed by excited yips. Curious, he climbed out of bed and made his way down the hallway. In the living room, Ollie was on his knees, playing tug-of-war with Max using an old sock. The puppy growled playfully, tail wagging as he pulled backward. When Max lost his grip and tumbled over, Ollie burst into another fit of giggles. His whole face lit up, eyes crinkling at the corners, cheeks flushed with joy. For the first time since arriving, he looked like what he was, just a kid. Ethan leaned against the wall, not wanting to interrupt. Max spotted him first, abandoning the sock to bounce over and paw at his legs. Ollie's smile faded slightly, but didn't disappear completely. "Hey," Ethan said, scratching Max behind the ears. An idea struck him as he glanced toward the kitchen. "You ever had real pancakes?" Ollie shook his head, eyes widening with interest. "Well," Ethan said, rolling up his sleeves, "guess we're having pancakes." In the kitchen, things quickly went sideways. Ethan hadn't cooked anything more complicated than microwave meals in months. The first batch came out black and smoking, making Ollie snicker from his perch on a kitchen stool. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, scraping the charred remains into the trash. Max circled hopefully below, sniffing at the burnt smell. The second attempt wasn't much better. Batter splattered everywhere as Ethan tried to flip them, and the smoke detector gave a warning chirp. Ollie's shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. "Think you can do better?" Ethan challenged, wiping flour from his face. "Nope," Ollie grinned. "But I'm not the one making a mess." Finally, on the third try, Ethan managed to produce something that actually looked like pancakes. Golden brown, slightly misshapen, but edible. He stacked them on plates, added butter and syrup, and set one in front of Ollie. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by Max's hopeful whines. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the kitchen. No pressure to talk about the past, no awkward questions about the future. Just breakfast on a quiet morning. As Ethan gathered the sticky plates and carried them to the sink, a realization hit him like a physical force. He actually liked having Ollie around. The thought stopped him in his tracks, hands frozen in the soapy water. The morning's peaceful mood shattered with a single phone call. Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter, displaying Judge Matthews' number. He answered it, expecting their usual casual chat. "You know that kid staying with you?" Matthews' voice was tight with concern. "I did some digging. His foster father filed a missing persons report. He wants him back." Ethan's blood ran cold. His eyes darted to Ollie, who sat cross-legged on the floor playing with Max. The boy looked up, sensing the change in Ethan's demeanor. "When?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Report was filed 3 days ago. Ray Holloway, that's the foster father. System shows Ollie's been with him for 8 months. Ethan hung up, his hands shaking. He tried to act normal, but his movements were stiff as he cleaned up the breakfast dishes. Ollie watched him closely, those observant eyes missing nothing. "What's wrong?" Ollie finally asked, hugging Max closer. Ethan dried his hands slowly, buying time. Should he tell him? Would knowing make things worse? The boy had only just started to relax, to trust. Instead, he sat down on the floor next to Ollie. "Can I ask you something?" When Ollie nodded, Ethan chose his words carefully. "What happens if you go back?" The change was instant. Ollie's whole body went rigid. Max whimpered, sensing his friend's distress. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken fears. "I don't want to go back," Ollie whispered finally, his voice small and broken. That was all Ethan needed to hear. That night, after Ollie fell asleep on the couch, Ethan sat at his desk with his laptop open. The soft glow of the screen illuminated his face as he dug deeper into Ray Holloway's history. What he found made his stomach turn. 3 different allegations of abuse in the past 5 years, all dismissed due to lack of evidence. 2 children who had stayed with him had gone missing, never to be found. Comments in case files about concerning behavior, but nothing concrete enough for charges. The pattern was clear. Ray Holloway was dangerous, and he knew how to work the system. If Ethan did nothing, Ollie would be sent straight back to him. Ethan closed his laptop with trembling hands, his jaw tight with determination. He looked over at Ollie's sleeping form, at the way Max curled protectively around the boy's feet. He might have let things slide before, might have looked the other way when the system failed, but not this time. He was going to fight, no matter what it takes. Ethan paced his office, the thick case files on Ray Holloway spread across his desk. His fingers drummed against the polished wood as he read through each document again. 3 abuse allegations, 2 missing children, dozens of red flags that somehow never led to consequences. The more he dug, the worse it got. His phone sat heavy in his hand as he dialed a familiar number. Judge Marion Greer had been his mentor years ago, back when he was fresh out of law school. If anyone knew a way through this mess, it would be her. "Ethan." Her voice was warm but cautious. "I heard about your situation. I need options, Marion. This boy can't go back there." There was a long pause on the other end. Without solid evidence or emergency guardianship filing, your hands are tied. The system defaults to the registered foster parent. Ethan's free hand curled into a fist. "There has to be something." "You know how this works," she said softly. "Good intentions aren't enough. You need proof." Back at the apartment, Ollie sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV. But his eyes kept darting to Ethan's closed office door. Max lay beside him, head on his lap, sensing his growing unease. The boy's shoulders were tense again, his old habits creeping back. He had stopped taking his shoes off at night, started eating faster, like the food might disappear. Every time Ethan's phone rang, Ollie flinched. He was preparing himself, Ethan realized, getting ready for the moment when everything fell apart. Again. Ethan watched him from the kitchen, feeling the weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders. This wasn't just about giving a kid a temporary place to stay anymore. This was about protecting someone who had never known what real protection felt like. Back in his office, Ethan stared at his computer screen, jaw clenched tight. The legal path looked impossible. The system was stacked against them, but he'd built his career on winning impossible cases. His mouse hovered over the emergency guardianship form. It would be a battle. Ray Holloway wouldn't give up easily. The courts would resist. But Ethan Reynolds didn't lose fights. Not when they mattered this much. He slammed his laptop shut, his decision made. He wasn't just keeping Ollie around out of obligation anymore. This was a fight now, and Ethan did not lose fights. That night, the muffled whimpers cut through the quiet apartment, pulling Ethan from his sleep. He blinked in the darkness, his mind taking a moment to register the sound. Pushing back his covers, he padded down the hallway, following the distressed noises to their source. In the living room, Ollie thrashed against the blankets on the couch, his breathing quick and shallow. Max paced anxiously beside him, letting out soft whines. Ethan stepped closer, hand hovering uncertainly, unsure whether to wake the boy. Before he could decide, Ollie jerked upright with a gasp, eyes wide and unfocused. Ollie's hands trembled as he roughly wiped at his face, shoulders hunched defensively. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though Ethan hadn't asked. The words came out shaky, unconvincing. Something twisted in Ethan's chest, a deep ache at seeing such raw fear in someone so young. Instead of pushing or asking questions, he simply lowered himself onto the far end of the couch and picked up the remote. The TV flickered to life, casting soft blue light across the room. After a few minutes, Ollie's breathing steadied. He shifted slightly, then settled back against the cushions. Max curled up at his feet, a warm, steady presence. The late-night infomercials droned on, filling the silence between them. "He used to lock us in closets." Ollie's voice was barely above a whisper. "When we made too much noise." Ethan's fingers tightened around the remote, his knuckles turning white. Hot anger surged through him, at Ray Holloway, at the broken system, at everyone who had failed this kid. But he kept his voice carefully controlled, steady and firm. "That won't happen again." Ollie didn't respond, but something in his posture changed, relaxed just slightly. For the first time since arriving, he seemed to truly believe those words. As the minutes ticked by, Ollie's eyes grew heavy. Eventually, he drifted off, slumped against the couch cushions beside Ethan. Ethan sat there, staring unseeing at the television screen, his mind filled with a single, crystal-clear thought. This kid was not going back to that monster. The morning sun filtered through the precinct windows as Ethan sat across from Detective Sarah Collins. Her desk was cluttered with case files and coffee cups, evidence of long hours spent pursuing justice. She looked exactly as he remembered, sharp eyes, no-nonsense demeanor, and an air of someone who'd seen too much. "I need your help, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. He laid out everything he knew, Ollie's nightmares, the closet punishments, Ray's history of foster kids disappearing. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her short hair. "Without direct evidence, we can't do anything," she said bluntly. "You know how this works, Ethan. The system needs proof." Ethan's jaw clenched. "What about witness statements? A former foster kid." Sarah sighed heavily, years of frustration evident in her voice. "We've tried before. Ray's victims are either too scared to talk or have disappeared entirely. He covers his tracks well." She tapped her fingers on the desk, a habit he recognized from their previous cases together. After a moment's hesitation, she reached into her drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Off the record," she said firmly, sliding it across the table. "You didn't get this from me." Back at his apartment, Ethan spread the documents across his dining room table. His eyes burned from hours of reading through case files, witness statements, and police reports. Then something caught his eye. A name buried in the paperwork. Elena Vasquez, a former foster kid who'd managed to escape years ago. He was so absorbed in the files that he didn't hear Ollie approach until the boy spoke. "Are you trying to keep me?" Ethan looked up, surprised by the directness of the question. Ollie stood there in his oversized borrowed sweater, Max sitting loyally at his feet. His expression was guarded, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of hope he couldn't quite hide. Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Yeah," he said with complete certainty. "I am." Ollie nodded quickly, turning away to hide his face, but not before Ethan caught the shine in his eyes. The boy reached down to scratch Max's ears, using the motion to compose himself. He'd never had anyone fight for him before, and the weight of that realization showed in the slight trembling of his shoulders. The small coffee shop buzzed with quiet conversation, but Ethan barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the woman sitting across from him, Elena Vasquez. She was in her mid-20s, with dark hair and watchful eyes that constantly scanned the room. Her fingers tapped nervously against her coffee cup, untouched and growing cold. "I shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I spent years trying to forget that place." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I know this is hard, but I need to understand what happened there. A boy's life depends on it." Elena's eyes flickered with recognition. She took a shaky breath. "Ray, he wasn't just abusive. It was worse than that. Kids would disappear sometimes. Nobody ever looked for them. Nobody cared." Her voice trembled as she continued. "There was this room in the basement, hidden behind some old shelves. That's where he—" She stopped, wrapping her arms around herself. "That's where the punishments happened." Ethan's stomach turned at her words. A hidden room! That could be the evidence they needed. Physical proof of Ray's crimes. "Would you be willing to testify?" he asked carefully. "Tell the court what you saw." Elena's face paled. "Number, I can't." She stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse. "I barely got away. Do you know what he'd do if he found me?" Ethan didn't push. Instead, he pulled out his business card and placed it on the table. "If you change your mind, call me. Please." She hesitated before taking the card, then hurried out of the cafe. Back at the apartment, Ethan found Ollie sitting on the windowsill, Max curled up beside him. The boy had been quiet all day, picking up on the tension that filled their home. "What if he wins?" Ollie asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers twisted in Max's fur, seeking comfort. Ethan crossed the room and crouched down to meet Ollie's eyes. "Then we fight harder." Later that night, as Ethan sat at his desk reviewing case files, his phone rang. His heart jumped when he saw the caller ID. "I'll talk," Elena's voice came through, determined despite its shakiness. "But you have to promise me he goes down for good." Ethan gripped the phone tightly. "I promise." Hours later, Elena sat across from Ethan at the quiet cafe, her hands trembling around her untouched coffee cup. Sunlight streamed through the window, but it did nothing to warm the chill that seemed to surround her. "I need to know this will work," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't go through this again if he walks free." Ethan leaned forward, his expression intense but reassuring. "I don't lose cases. If you tell your story, I'll make sure he never hurts another kid again." Elena took a deep, shaky breath and began to speak. Her words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. She described the basement room in detail. The heavy door hidden behind old storage shelves, the cold concrete walls, the complete darkness when Ray locked them inside. "Some kids disappeared after going down there," she said, her voice cracking. "We'd never see them again. Ray would say they'd been moved to different homes, but we knew better." She wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back tears. "I got lucky. I managed to run away before I could become one of them." Ethan recorded everything, his mind already mapping out legal strategies. If they could find physical evidence of this room, it would be enough to launch a full investigation. The testimony of a former victim combined with concrete proof, it could work. Meanwhile, back at Ethan's apartment, Ollie had transformed the living room couch into his own personal sanctuary. Blankets draped over the cushions created a makeshift fort, with Max curled up contentedly beside him. For the first time in his young life, he felt truly safe. When Ethan returned home that evening, his face was tight with tension. Ollie noticed immediately. He'd gotten good at reading adults' expressions over the years. "What's wrong?" he asked, peeking out from his blanket fortress. Ethan considered sugarcoating it, but decided against it. Ollie had been through too much to be treated like a fragile child. "We have a witness," he said honestly, "but we need more proof." Ollie was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Max's fur. Then, in a small but steady voice, he said, "I know where the basement is. Ethan's blood ran cold at those words. Ethan paced his living room, running his hands through his hair. The legal route would take too long. Every day they waited for a warrant was another day Ray could destroy evidence, or worse, hurt another child. "I'm going to check the house myself," he announced, grabbing his car keys. Ollie jumped up from his blanket fort, Max at his heels. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not." "I know where everything is," Ollie insisted, his small face set with determination. "The basement door is hidden. You won't find it without me." Ethan started to refuse again, but something in the boy's eyes made him pause. This wasn't just about helping. It was about facing his fears. "Fine," Ethan said finally, "but you stay in the car. No matter what. Deal?" Ollie nodded solemnly. The drive to Ray's house was tense and silent. The old property sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken fence posts. No lights were on inside. Ray's car was gone. "Stay here," Ethan whispered, parking behind some trees. "Lock the doors. If anything happens, use my phone to call this number." He handed Ollie his cell with Detective Collins' number ready to dial. The back door's lock was old and simple. Within seconds, Ethan was inside. The house smelled musty and cold. Following Ollie's instructions, he found the basement entrance hidden behind a shelf of cleaning supplies. The stairs creaked under his feet as he descended. His flashlight beam revealed concrete walls and a dirt floor. In the corner, exactly where Elna had described, was a heavy wooden door. Chains hung from metal loops bolted into the wall. Deep scratch marks scarred the door's surface. Ethan's hand shook as he took photos with his spare phone. Behind the wooden door was a small storage room. The smell hit him immediately. Something rotting, something wrong. A sudden flash of light from above made his heart stop. Headlights swept across the basement windows. Car doors slammed. Ray was back. Ethan killed his flashlight and moved silently up the stairs. He could hear keys jingling at the front door. Moving quickly but quietly, he slipped out the back entrance just as the front door opened. He ran to the car, diving into the driver's seat. Ollie and Max were huddled in the back, eyes wide with fear. Without a word, Ethan started the engine and drove away, keeping his lights off until they were well clear of the property. In the rearview mirror, he could see Ray's silhouette in the doorway, watching the darkness where they had disappeared. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he laid out the photos on Detective Collins' desk. Each image told its own horrific story. The chains, the scratches, the hidden room that reeked of despair. Sarah's expression hardened as she examined them one by one. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "These photos, combined with Elena's testimony, we can finally nail him." She gathered the photos carefully, sliding them into an evidence envelope. "But Ethan," she added, meeting his eyes, "we'll need Ollie to testify." Without his first-hand account, Ray's lawyers could still find ways to explain this away. Ethan's stomach knotted. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it said out loud made it real. "He's just a kid, Sarah." "I know," she said softly, "but he's also our best chance at putting Ray away for good." Back at the apartment, Ethan found Ollie and Max in their usual spot on the couch. The TV was playing some cartoon about superheroes, but Ollie wasn't really watching it. He could always tell when something was wrong. "They're going after Ray," Ethan said carefully, sitting down beside him. "We have enough evidence now." Ollie's whole body tensed. His fingers curled into Max's fur and the puppy whined softly, sensing his distress. The boy didn't speak, didn't move, just stared straight ahead at the TV screen. Ethan didn't push. He knew what it was like to feel cornered, to need space to process. Instead, he settled back into the couch, pretending to watch the cartoon. On screen, a hero in a cape was saving the day. If only real life were that simple. Minutes ticked by. Max shifted positions, curling closer to Ollie. The cartoon ended, and another began. Still, they sat in silence. Finally, in a voice so quiet Ethan almost missed it, Ollie asked, "If I do this, does that mean he can't take me back?" Ethan turned to face him. "Not just that," he said gently. "It means he can't hurt anyone else ever again." Ollie absorbed this, his young face full of thoughts too heavy for his age. The silence stretched on, broken only by Max's soft breathing and the muted sounds from the TV. Then, barely above a whisper, "Okay." Ethan watched as Ollie pulled Max closer, burying his face in the puppy's fur. The dog licked his cheek, tail wagging gently, offering comfort in the way only animals can. The decision hung in the air between them, terrifying but final. The trial date loomed over them like a storm cloud. Ethan's apartment had transformed into a makeshift war room, with case files and legal documents covering every surface. He worked late into the night, his eyes burning from staring at his laptop screen, determined to build an ironclad case against Ray Holloway. But while Ethan fought his battle with paperwork, Ollie fought his own demons. The boy picked at his food, pushing it around his plate without eating. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, evidence of nights spent tossing and turning. Max stayed glued to his side, whimpering whenever Ollie woke up, gasping from another nightmare. One night, after a particularly bad dream, Ollie appeared in Ethan's doorway, Max clutched in his arms. His voice was small and shaky. Can I sleep in here?" Ethan didn't even pause to think. He got up and pulled out a sleeping bag from his closet, spreading it on the floor beside his bed. Ollie watched him, shifting from foot to foot. "Just for tonight," the boy mumbled, but they both knew better. The next morning, Ethan made his way to the courthouse to meet with Judge Marion Greer. Her office was warm and lived in, with photos of children she'd helped covering one wall. She listened intently as Ethan laid out his concerns. "I just need to know it'll be fair," he said, his voice tight with worry. "The system, it's failed him before." Judge Greer's eyes softened. "I'll do everything in my power, Ethan. You have my word." But Ray wasn't going down without a fight. His defense team launched their attack, painting Ollie as an unreliable witness. They dug up old records, a stolen candy bar from a convenience store, missed school days, minor infractions that seemed damning on paper. Ethan's blood boiled as he read through their motion. These weren't signs of a troubled kid. They were proof of a child trying to survive. But would the jury see it that way? Back home, Ollie sat curled up in his usual corner of the couch, but his usual fortress of pillows felt more like a shield now. Max rested his head on Ollie's knee, offering silent comfort. "What if they don't believe me?" Ollie's voice cracked slightly. His fingers twisted in Max's fur, seeking comfort. Ethan crossed the room and crouched down beside him, meeting his eyes. "Then I'll make them believe." That night, as Ethan reached for the light switch in his room, he felt a small hand grab his. Ollie stood there, not saying a word, but his grip was tight. It was a silent gesture that spoke volumes. The first time he'd reached out, truly reached out, to trust someone completely. The courthouse buzzed with activity, its marble halls filled with reporters and curious onlookers. Camera flashes lit up the steps outside as Ethan guided Ollie through the crowd, one hand protectively on the boy's shoulder. Max padded along beside them, wearing his newly approved service animal vest. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thick with tension. Ethan and Ollie took their seats at the plaintiff's table, while across the aisle, Ray Holloway settled into his chair with an easy smile. His defense team, dressed in expensive suits, arranged their papers with practiced efficiency. Ray caught Ollie's eye and smirked, making the boy shrink closer to Max. The trial began with a hush falling over the packed gallery. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s, laid out the charges in clear, devastating terms. Her voice carried through the courtroom as she described the pattern of abuse, the suspicious disappearances, and the evidence of human trafficking. Ethan presented his findings methodically. The photographs of the basement flashed across the screen. The chains, the scratch marks, the locked room. Detective Sarah Collins took the stand, her testimony painting a picture of systematic abuse and institutional failure. But Ray's defense team remained unmoved, their objections precise and calculated. "Your Honor," Ray's attorney stood, his voice smooth as silk, "none of this evidence directly connects my client to any harm done to Oliver Carter." Then came the attack on Ollie's character. The defense pulled out file after file. Incident reports from previous foster homes, school records showing truancy, petty theft charges that had been dismissed. Each revelation felt like a physical blow. "What we have here," the defense attorney declared, gesturing toward Ollie, "is a troubled boy with a history of lying, running away, and manipulating the system." Ollie's fingers wrapped tightly around Max's leash under the table, his knuckles turning white. The dog pressed closer, sensing his distress. Ethan watched the boy's face pale, saw the familiar fear creeping back into his eyes, and knew he had to act. Rising to his feet, Ethan's voice cut through the murmurs of the courtroom like steel. "Then let's hear from someone else who lived under Ray Holloway's roof." The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Elena Vasquez stepped inside, her head held high despite her trembling hands. The courtroom fell silent as Elena approached the witness stand. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing in the hushed chamber. She wore a simple navy blazer, her dark hair pulled back neatly, but her hands shook as she placed them on the wooden rail. After she was sworn in, Ethan approached. His voice was gentle but firm. "Ms. Vasquez, can you tell us about your time in Ray Holloway's home?" Elena's eyes flickered briefly to Ray before focusing on Ethan. "I was 12 when I first arrived," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The microphone carried her words across the silent courtroom. At first it seemed okay, but then... She described the basement in vivid detail, the damp concrete walls, the metal rings bolted at different heights, the soundproof padding. Her words painted pictures that made several jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "There were others," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Jenny Martinez. She was 8. Tommy Chen just turned 10. Marcus Williams, 13. She listed the names like a prayer. They disappeared one by one. Ray would tell us they'd been moved to new homes, but we knew better." Ethan stepped closer to the witness stand. "What did Ray tell you would happen if you spoke up?" Elena's fingers gripped the wooden rail. "He said no one would believe us, that we were just troubled kids making up stories." Her voice caught. "He said we'd disappear too, like the others." In the defendant's chair, Ray shifted for the first time since the trial began. His composed facade cracked slightly as he tugged at his collar. "Did you ever think you'd make it out?" Ethan asked softly. Elena's eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I'd die there." The jury seemed to collectively hold their breath. An older woman in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth. A middle-aged man in the back row removed his glasses, wiping his eyes. As Elena stepped down from the witness stand, Ethan glanced at Ray. The man's earlier smugness had vanished completely. Instead, he sat rigid in his chair, his face pale, his eyes darting between his lawyers. For the first time since the trial began, Ray Holloway looked worried. Ollie's small frame seemed to shrink even further as he approached the witness stand. His sneakers barely touched the floor once he sat down, and his hands twisted nervously in his lap. The bailiff stepped forward, holding out the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked in a gentle tone. Ollie's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I do." Ethan approached carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He positioned himself between Ollie and Ray, creating a barrier that helped the boy relax slightly. "Can you tell us about living with Ray Holloway?" Ethan asked softly. Ollie's eyes darted around the courtroom before settling on Max, who sat quietly with Elena in the gallery. The sight of his faithful companion seemed to give him strength. "He seemed nice at first," Ollie began, his voice growing steadier. "But then things changed. If we made noise, he'd lock us in the basement, sometimes for days." Ethan guided him through the testimony with patience, letting Ollie take his time. The boy described the darkness, the hunger, the sound of other children crying. His hands trembled, but his voice held firm. When Ray's defense attorney stood for cross-examination, his approach was immediate and harsh. "Isn't it true that you've run away from every foster home you've been in?" he demanded. Ollie flinched. "Not every." "And isn't it true that you've been caught stealing? Fighting at school? Lying to teachers?" The boy's shoulders started to curl inward, his defense mechanisms kicking in. His eyes dropped to his lap, and his voice grew quieter. But then he caught Ethan's gaze. Ethan gave him a small, confident nod, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. Something shifted in Ollie's expression. His spine straightened, and he lifted his chin. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You're just scared I finally told the truth." The defense attorney's mouth opened and closed, thrown off by the sudden show of defiance. The courtroom fell into complete silence, the weight of Ollie's words hanging in the air. Ray's face twisted with rage, his carefully maintained facade cracking completely. The jury members leaned forward, their expressions a mix of sympathy and belief as they looked at the brave young boy on the stand. Ethan felt the shift in the room, the moment when doubt transformed into certainty. In standing up to his tormentor, Ollie had done more than just testify. He had shown everyone exactly who he was. Not a troubled kid making up stories, but a survivor finally speaking his truth. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows hours later. Ethan stood at his desk, shuffling through his notes one last time. His fingers traced the edges of photographs, witness statements, and medical records, pieces of evidence that told a story of horror and survival. The defense team huddled in whispered conversation, their expensive suits and confident smirks a stark contrast to the quiet determination on Ethan's face. Ray sat between his lawyers, looking more irritated than concerned. When the defense made their closing argument, their strategy became clear. The lead attorney gestured dramatically toward Elena. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, consider Miss Vasquez's motivation," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "A troubled past, a desire for attention, perhaps even revenge against the man who tried to help her." Elena's hands clenched in her lap, but she held her head high. The defense attorney moved on to the photographs, suggesting they could have been staged or manipulated. He painted Ray as a misunderstood savior, taking in difficult children that nobody else wanted. "Is it any surprise these troubled youth would turn on him?" he asked, spreading his hands wide. "Is it any wonder they'd craft these wild tales?" When Ethan rose for his closing statement, the courtroom fell silent. He didn't rush to the podium or raise his voice. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the defense's theatrical display. "The defense wants you to believe this is about revenge," he began, his voice steady. "They want you to focus on past behavioral issues, on small infractions that desperate children committed to survive. But this isn't about troubled youth lashing out." He picked up a stack of missing person reports. "This is about Sarah, age 12, who vanished from Ray Holloway's home 3 years ago." He placed the paper down. "About Marcus, age 9, who disappeared without a trace." Another paper. "About Katie, age 11, who was never seen again." Then, in a move that made his own heart race, Ethan turned to face Ray directly. "You had a chance to prove us wrong," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "You could have taken the stand and denied everything. But you didn't, because you know we're telling the truth." Ray's face darkened, a flash of rage breaking through his carefully maintained facade. His lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but it was too late. The mask had slipped, and every person in that jury box had seen what lay beneath. Judge Greer called for final remarks, her gavel echoing through the chamber. The jury filed out, their faces serious and thoughtful. As they disappeared behind the deliberation room door, Ethan returned to his seat beside Ollie. He placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the slight tremor running through him. The courtroom buzzed with tension as they settled in to wait. Max, sensing Ollie's anxiety, pressed closer to his legs under the table. There was nothing more they could do now but wait. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the jury filed back in, their faces solemn and unreadable. Ollie sat rigid beside Ethan, his small fingers wrapped so tightly around Max's leash that his knuckles had turned white. The puppy pressed closer to his legs, sensing his anxiety. Across the aisle, Ray Holloway maintained his stone-faced expression. But there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. His defense attorney leaned over, whispering something urgently in his ear, but Ray barely seemed to hear him. Judge Greer's voice cut through the thick silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, a single piece of paper trembling slightly in his hands. "We have, Your Honor." Time seemed to slow down as the foreman cleared his throat. "On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant, Ray Holloway, guilty." A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Ethan felt his chest loosen, just slightly. "On the charge of felony child abuse, we find the defendant, guilty." The weight that had been pressing on Ethan's chest for weeks finally lifted, but the foreman wasn't finished. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, we find the defendant guilty." The word had barely left the foreman's mouth when Ray exploded from his seat. "This is all lies," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. "It's a setup. You can't do this to me." He jabbed a finger toward Ethan and Ollie. "They're lying. They're all lying." Bailiffs rushed forward as Judge Greer's gavel cracked against the sound block. "Order! Order in the court!" But Ethan wasn't watching Ray anymore. His eyes were fixed on Ollie. The boy sat perfectly still, his eyes wide and disbelieving. Slowly, something shifted in his expression, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He was free. Really, truly free. Judge Greer's voice rang out over the chaos. "Ray Holloway, this court sentences you to 25 years imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The gavel fell one final time, the sound echoing through the now quiet courtroom. Ollie turned to Ethan, his voice small and uncertain. "So, what happens now?" Ethan felt a smile spread across his face, the first real smile in days. "Now, we go home." The courthouse steps felt different now. As Ethan and Ollie walked down them together, Max trotting happily between them, the weight of Ray's presence was finally gone. But a new challenge lay ahead, one that involved mountains of paperwork and proving to the state that Ethan deserved to be Ollie's legal guardian. Back at the apartment, Ethan spread out the adoption forms across his desk. The sheer volume was daunting, but he attacked them with the same determination he'd shown in court. Each document represented another step toward making their makeshift family official. Social workers came and went, inspecting every corner of the apartment. They asked endless questions about Ethan's work schedule, his support system, his plans for Ollie's education. Ethan answered each one patiently, determined to prove he could provide the stability Ollie needed. Ollie watched it all with cautious eyes. He'd shuffle around during the home visits, keeping Max close, answering questions politely but briefly. At night, he'd peek at the growing stack of paperwork on Ethan's desk, but never asked about it directly. As weeks passed, their lives fell into a routine. Max had claimed the expensive leather couch as his personal domain, leaving fur everywhere despite Ethan's half-hearted protests. The puppy had grown plump and happy, a far cry from the shivering stray they'd found that snowy night. Ollie started attending the local middle school. That first morning, he stood in front of the mirror, tugging nervously at his new backpack straps. Ethan watched him from the doorway, remembering his own school days. "You've got this," Ethan said simply. Ollie nodded, squared his shoulders, and headed out. Between court appearances and client meetings, Ethan found himself rushing to soccer practice sidelines, parent-teacher conferences, and impromptu pancake dinners when homework ran late. His perfectly organized schedule had been completely upended, and surprisingly, he didn't mind at all. One evening after they'd finished dinner, Ethan walked into his home office to find Ollie standing by his desk, staring at the folder of adoption papers. Before Ethan could speak, Ollie turned around, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would it be okay if I stayed?" he asked, fidgeting with his sleeve. "For real?" Ethan's response was immediate. "Yeah, kid. I was hoping you would." Ollie nodded, then took a deep breath. "Thanks, Dad." Ethan froze for just a moment, caught off guard by the word he never expected to hear. Then, smiling warmly, he reached out and ruffled Ollie's hair. "You're welcome, kid." 6 months had passed since that first trial, and once again, Ethan and Ollie found themselves in a courtroom. But this time, everything felt different. The air wasn't heavy with tension. Instead, it buzzed with nervous excitement. Max, now sporting a proper service dog vest, sat quietly at Ollie's feet, his tail thumping softly against the polished floor. Judge Marion Greer sat behind the bench, her usual stern expression softened by a hint of warmth as she reviewed the adoption papers. The courtroom was nearly empty, just a few necessary witnesses and Elena Vasquez, who'd become a regular visitor at their apartment over the past months. Ethan straightened his tie for the 10th time that morning. He'd won countless cases in this very room, but somehow this felt bigger than any of them. Ollie sat beside him, wearing a new button-down shirt that still had the creases from the store. The boy's leg bounced nervously under the table, but his eyes were clear and determined. Judge Greer looked up from the papers, her gaze settling on Ollie. The question came gently but firmly. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Ollie didn't fidget or look away. His voice was steady, stronger than it had been during the trial. "Yeah, he's my family." Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. All those years of keeping his emotions in check, of maintaining professional distance, and here he was, nearly undone by 4 simple words from a kid who'd started out as just another problem to solve. The judge's smile widened as she picked up her pen. The scratch of ink against paper seemed impossibly loud in the quiet courtroom. Then she looked up, her eyes bright. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "It's official." Ollie's face broke into a wide grin, the kind that still surprised Ethan every time he saw it. Ethan squeezed his shoulder, feeling the solid reality of this moment. This boy who was now, legally and in every other way that mattered, his son. For the first time in both their lives, they had a real home. The autumn air was crisp and clean as Ethan sat on a weathered park bench, watching Ollie and Max chase each other across the grass. Golden leaves drifted down around them, catching in Max's fur as he bounded after a well-worn tennis ball. The dog had filled out nicely over the past months, his coat now glossy and thick, a far cry from the scrawny puppy that had shown up at their door that snowy night. Ollie's laughter echoed across the park, a sound that still caught Ethan off guard sometimes. The boy who'd once flinched at sudden movements now ran freely, his arms spread wide as Max playfully nipped at his heels. His new sneakers left marks in the damp grass as he zigzagged between trees, calling out encouragement to Max. Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. His phone buzzed with work emails, but for once, he didn't feel compelled to check them. Instead, he watched his son, the word still felt new and wonderful, chase after the tennis ball that Max had dropped mid-pursuit. "Come on, Max," Ollie shouted, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "You're getting slow." The dog barked in response, tail wagging as he bounded after both boy and ball. Their game continued until both were thoroughly worn out, Max's tongue lolling out as he trotted alongside Ollie back to the bench. Ollie collapsed next to Ethan, breathing hard but grinning. His hair was tousled from running, and grass stains marked his jeans. "I beat Max," he declared proudly, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Ethan raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at his lips. "Yeah? Pretty sure he let you win." Ollie snorted at that, but then fell quiet, his expression turning thoughtful. Max settled at their feet, content to rest his head on Ollie's shoes. The park around them was peaceful, families walking by, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. After a long pause, Ollie spoke again, his voice softer. "Thanks for not giving up on me." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan knew what they had cost Ollie to say, knew the years of abandonment and disappointment that lay behind them. He thought about all the times people had given up on this remarkable kid, all the chances they'd missed to see who he really was. "Any time, kid," Ethan replied, his voice gruff with emotion. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the park. As the evening chill began to settle in, they gathered their things, Max's tennis ball, Ollie's jacket that he'd discarded during their game, the water bottles they'd brought along. Together, the three of them headed home. A family at last. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Ollie, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.